Hello, Virgo. 7 hours. I want you to feel the specificity of that. Not soon, not shortly, not in the coming days. 7 hours, which is the distance between now and something that is already in motion in the interior of someone who has been carrying something toward this moment for longer than 7 hours, but whose delivery of it is 7 hours away from the moment you are in right now. Reading this, 7 hours is a meal. It is a night's sleep. It is the time between the morning and the afternoon, or between the afternoon and the evening. Depending on when you are reading this, it is the specific and countable distance between what is now and what is about to be. In the form of someone admitting something, that will blow your mind. When it arrives, in whatever form an admission takes, in the specific dynamic between you and this person, welcome, and do not look away from this in the next 7 hours. For any reason, I want to start with the word admit, because admit is not the same as reveal, and it is not the same as share or disclose or even confess, though confess is closer. And the distinction between admit and all of those other words is what makes the 7 hours significant. In the specific way they are significant. To admit something in the full and honest form of the word is to acknowledge something that has been held in the protected form of something whose full acknowledgement has been resisted or delayed or managed into a smaller form than the full form it actually is, to avoid the exposure that the full acknowledgement produces in the person admitting and in the relationship between the person admitting and the person receiving the admission. Admitting something costs something in the specific form of the exposure of what was being protected and the vulnerability of what the admission might produce in the person receiving it, which is not within the control of the person making it. Once the admission has been made and is no longer protectable in the contained and unexpressed form that preceded the admission, the person who is admitting something to you in 7 hours is doing something costly in the specific form I described, and they are doing it anyway, which is the most important thing about the 7 hours that I want you to understand before I tell you what they are admitting and why it will blow your mind. They are doing something costly because the cost of continuing to hold it has finally exceeded the cost of admitting it in the specific calculation that every held thing eventually arrives at when the holding has lasted long enough for the cost of the holding to exceed the cost of the releasing. The holding was costing more than they had available to pay in the form of the continued containing of something that has been growing rather than diminishing in the holding, and the growth produced the pressure that is now tipping the calculation in the direction of admitting rather than continuing to hold. The admission is inevitable. Now, in the specific and imminent form of 7 hours from when you are reading this, let me tell you what they are admitting in the substance of it, because the substance is what will blow your mind. And I want to deliver it in the most specific form I can offer from the reading of the energy around the situation between you. They are admitting that they were wrong in the specific and complete form of someone who has arrived at the full understanding of what they were wrong about and what being wrong produced in you and in the connection between you and in the version of things that their being wrong created, rather than the version that would have existed if they had not been wrong in the way they were wrong for as long as they were wrong. I want to describe what they were wrong about in the most specific terms available to me from the reading of the energy, because wrong is a large category, and the specific form of the wrongness is what determines the specific form of the admission and what the admission will mean when it arrives in the 7 hours and reorganizes how everything looked. Before it arrived, they were wrong about you, specifically in the form of an assessment of who you are and what you are capable of and what your motives were in the specific situations that the wrongness was producing an incorrect reading of, while it was operating as the dominant interpretation of who you were and what you were doing and why. The incorrect reading produced behavior in them that was based on the incorrect reading rather than on who you actually are and what your motives actually were. In the situations the incorrect reading was interpreting, and the behavior produced by the incorrect reading was not what you deserved from someone who was responding to who you actually are, rather than to the incorrect reading of who they thought you were in the period of the wrongness. The admission is the correction of the incorrect reading in the honest and direct form of someone who has arrived at the actual reading and who wants you to know that the actual reading is different from the one they were acting from in the specific and significant ways that the actual reading changes everything about how the period of the incorrect reading looks. In retrospect, from the position of someone who now knows what was actually happening, rather than what the incorrect reading was suggesting was happening. That they knew at some level, before the admission is being made, what the truth was, and chose the convenient version instead in the specific form of self-deception that is technically honest in the sense of not being deliberate lying, but that is practically dishonest in the sense of having access to the truth and choosing not to fully inhabit it, because inhabiting it would have required the admission that is now being made in the 7-hour window that follows this reading. The knowing and the choosing of the convenient version instead is the thing that will blow your mind, because it reveals that what you sometimes suspected or felt or knew in the quiet and unconfirmed form of an intuition that did not have the evidence. To be named directly and acted on directly was accurate, and that the convenient version that was being presented in the visible and expressed form was constructed rather than true. In the full and complete form, that truth is when it is not being managed. Into the convenient version, your intuition was right. The admission is the confirmation of the intuition that you have been carrying. Without the confirmation, that would have made the carrying easier. And the admission is arriving now in the specific and imminent form of someone who can no longer hold the convenient version against the pressure of what they actually know and what the holding of the convenient version has been costing them in the accumulated form of the cost I described as the tipping point. That produced the decision to admit rather than to continue holding. I want to say something about what blowing your mind actually means in this specific situation, because blow your mind is a phrase that is used frequently as the dramatic amplification of something surprising, and I want to give it the specific meaning that applies here rather than the general dramatic meaning that the phrase sometimes carries when it is used to signal that something significant is coming. Without the specific nature of the significance being described, blowing your mind in this context means reorganizing the specific architecture of how you understood the situation between you and this person in a way that changes not just your understanding of one specific thing, but the foundational interpretation of what was actually happening. In the period before the admission, when the convenient version was the only version available to you because the admission was being held, the admission reorganizes the interpretation in the retroactive form of something being revealed. That changes how everything before it looks, rather than only how everything after it looked. And the retroactive reorganization is what the blow your mind is actually describing. The specific and significant reconfiguration of how you understand what was happening before the admission revealed that it was different from what was being shown. I want to describe what the reorganization feels like from the inside of the person experiencing it, because I think preparing you for the feeling is as important as preparing you for the content of the admission itself, since the feeling is what most people are not prepared for. When something retroactively reorganizes, how they understand what happened before the reorganizing information arrived, the reorganization feels like vertigo, the specific and disorienting experience of your understanding of a situation shifting underneath you in the way that ground shifting produces the physical vertigo of suddenly not knowing where your footing is in the landscape you were standing in before the shift. The cognitive vertigo of retroactive reorganization is the experience of not knowing for a brief period how to interpret what happened before, because the interpretive framework you were using to understand it has just been revealed as incomplete or inaccurate in the ways the admission is revealing it as. And the new framework that the admission is providing has not yet had time to be fully integrated into the stable and settled form of a complete interpretation that you can stand on with the full confidence of someone who knows what they are standing on. The vertigo passes as the new framework settles into the integrated form, and what remains after the settling is a clearer and more accurate understanding of what was actually happening. In the period the reorganization is addressing than the understanding you had before the admission, when the convenient version was the only available version. Let the vertigo pass before responding to the admission or deciding what the admission means for what happens next. Give the settling the time it needs to produce the stable and integrated form of the new understanding that the reorganization is creating from the material of the admission and what it reveals about what was actually happening before it was admitted, for how to receive this admission. When it arrives in 7 hours, because receiving an admission of this kind from someone who is doing something costly in making it requires a specific kind of presence and a specific kind of internal preparation that is different from the preparation for the ordinary arrivals of things you were expecting in the form you were expecting them. The first thing the receiving requires is to let the blow your mind land before responding. The retroactive reorganization I described takes a moment to complete in the full form of something that is changing how everything looks, rather than only how one thing looks. And the moment of reorganization is not the moment for the response, because the response that comes from inside the blow your mind is the response to the first impact of the admission, rather than the response to the full and integrated understanding of what was admitted and what it means, which takes the reorganization time to complete before it is fully available as the basis for a response. Let the reorganization happen. Before responding, the second thing the receiving requires is to acknowledge the cost of the admission to the person making it, not in the managed form of a response that is performed for the benefit of the person who made the costly choice, but in the honest form of someone who genuinely recognizes that what was just given cost something real to the person who gave it and who receives it accordingly, as something that deserves acknowledgement as the costly thing it is, rather than only as the revelation of information that was being held and is now available. The person who admits something costly is not only giving you information, They are giving you something of themselves in the form of the exposure that the admission creates and the acknowledgement of that exposure is part of what the full receiving of an admission of this kind requires. And the third thing the receiving requires is honesty about what the admission produces in you, in the real and unmanaged form of what you actually feel when what was being held has been admitted, and the convenient version is no longer the only available version of what was happening between you and this person in the period before the admission. The honesty about what it produces in you is the most important of the three things, because it is what determines what happens next between you and the person who admitted in the 7 hours from now, in whatever form the next looks like, for two specific people in a specific dynamic, after something costly has been admitted and received in the full and present form that the receiving deserves. 7 hours is the distance between now and when the admission arrives in the specific form it is taking for the specific person who has been holding it against the cost of the holding until the cost exceeded the capacity and the admission became the only available option for someone who is choosing the honesty of the admission over the comfort of the continued holding. That choice is already made, and the 7 hours is the distance between the made choice and the delivered choice in the form of the admission that will reorganize how you understand what was happening before the admission arrived and revealed it. Whew. I want to speak about what the 7 hours themselves feel like to inhabit when you know something is coming but do not yet have it in the full and present form of its arrival, because the quality of the 7 hours is as important as the quality of the admission itself. For what the admission is able to produce in you and in the connection between you when it finally arrives. The 7 hours can be inhabited in two very different ways. The first way is the anxious anticipation way, where the knowing that something is coming produces the particular and consuming attention to every signal and every interaction in the 7 hours that might indicate something about the admission, or when it is coming, or in what form, or whether it is actually coming in the form that the reading promised, rather than in some other form, or not at all. This way of inhabiting the 7 hours is exhausting, and it leaves you less present for the admission when it arrives, because the energy that would have been available for the receiving has been consumed by the anxious anticipation of the 7 hours themselves. The second way is the one I am recommending, which is the present and grounded way of someone who knows something is coming and who has done what can be done to prepare for it in the form of this reading, and who is now simply in the 7 hours as they are in the ordinary and present form of the hours between now and the arrival of what is coming, without requiring the hours to be anything other than what they are, which is ordinary hours, between something significant and something equally significant. Be in the ordinary hours fully and let the admission arrive. When it arrives, in the form it takes, without having exhausted yourself in the anticipation of it, before it has had the chance to arrive and be received in the full form that you now have, all the preparation you need to receive it in the specific form of someone who is prepared to let their mind be blown by what is coming, rather than to manage the blowing into something more comfortable and therefore smaller than what the admission actually is. When it arrives in its full form, 7 hours, and then the admission, that changes how everything looked. Before it arrived, your mind is about to be blown in the complete and retroactive form of something that was being held, finally released into the full and present form of an admission that reorganizes everything